The coup happened in Gabon, of all places in Gabon, and everyone was happy. There still are. All over Africa, everyone is celebrating this one because this one is different, but not everyone is happy. France, for example, they are not happy about it, and I will tell you why. So they have condemned it alongside the UN and the African Union.
In other world news, the coup in Gabon is being condemned by the United Nations, the African Union and France. Military leaders have appointed Army General Brice Oligui Nguema as transitional leader. Deposed President Ali Bongo is still under house arrest and the government has been dissolved.
For the UN, they usually do that. We understand. The African Union, well, there is a club of African dictators. People like Paul Kagame, Museveni, Paul Biya, Emmerson Mnangagwa from Zimbabwe, those people. So definitely a coup is something that threatens their own existence. So they don't like it. So they have to condemn it. It doesn't matter. They have to condemn it. And the reason I'm saying this coup is different is because it has rattled African dictators. They are scared because according to the latest news is that Rwanda, Cameroon, and Uganda have made major changes in their military top positions today in the morning. And one of the articles says that the Rwanda Defense Force released a statement disclosing Paul Kagame's approval of the retirement of 12 generals, 83 senior officers, and 6 junior officers. Additionally, 86 senior non-commissioned officers will be retired. So about 700 soldiers retired as their contract was terminated. So Paul Kagame has fired all his generals in the army because he fears they are planning to remove him. And in Cameroon, then the story goes that Cameroon, in reaction to the spread of military coups on the African continent, have taken proactive steps by reshuffling defense portfolios. And the Cameroonian president is 91 years. This guy suffers from dementia, right? Sometimes he even forgets where he is. He keeps asking, where am I? Who are these people? Those kind of questions. So he still wants to continue ruling until his own child, daughter or son, is of age to take over from him. Definitely. But the other reason about France, why is France not happy? France has been milking Gabon for the past 100 years, taking everything from Gabon and giving nothing back. For example, Gabon is the only African or the only country in the world that sells its crude oil pegged on the dollar or the euro, but they don't get dollars or euros, but instead are paid in useless paper money manufactured in the French central bank called the CFA franc. The CFA franc is the paper currency that France or the central bank in France manufactures on behalf of 14 African countries. Gabon is one of those countries, and what they do is that they peg this CFA franc, that is 650 CFA franc to 1 euro, and once French companies mine minerals, timber, manganese, crude oil from Gabon or from Niger, in the case of uranium, they don't pay it in euros or dollars. They pay it using this CFA franc that is made in France. So, for example, if a French company owed Gabon 1 million euros, they don't bring 1 million euros. So instead, they send 650 million CFA franc to them. So they go to the French government, get this money from the central bank in France after printing it, and then they bring it to Gabon. That's how they pay them. And you'll be shocked how much of this CFA franc is in circulation in these countries, because there's no checks and balances by their governments to determine how much France actually prints. So this video where some people who are part of the celebration of the coup came upon hundreds of bags full of CFA currency in one of the homes of a government official in Gabon. Just watch.
Did you know France makes Africa pay for its own foreign aid by manipulating the West African franc? Based on a review of public financial reports, it appears France has never actually used its own money to help Africa. I'm about to discuss one of the most elaborate financial cons since the original Ponzi scheme, and no matter how bad you think this is, don't worry, it gets worse. First, the backstory. France controls the creation of money for 14 countries in Africa, a legacy of colonialism. We call this either the West or Central African franc, depending on the country. Every year, France prints between 20 and 40 billion euros worth of this African currency, which it uses to buy natural resources, influence African leaders, and occasionally provide some developmental aid. Pay attention. France prints the Africans' own paper currency and then exchanges the currency they just printed for physical goods and resources. You might be tempted to call this counterfeiting, but they already have a word for this in French. It's called seigneurage. Here's how the French have flown under the radar. France manages this African currency by pegging the West and Central African franc to the euro at a 6.55 to 1 exchange rate. This has made the African franc one of the most stable and predictable currencies in Africa today. You may even think at first glance that the West African franc is essentially a euro. Except it's not. When the European Central Bank expands the money supply, aka creates more euros, this gives the French Central Bank the authority to print more African francs. Now, over the past 10 years, the Euro M2 money supply has been increased between 60 and 66%, which means for every billion West African francs that were printed for Africa, the Central Bank in France was able to print over 600 million West African francs of their own, which means they can practically do whatever they want with that money. We can only estimate these financial numbers because the actual amount is a bit obfuscated by the French banks for obvious reasons. However, when we add up the M2 money supply for these 14 African countries and multiply it by the estimated expansion of the West African francs, France appears to be printing between 20 and 40 billion euros worth of African currency every year exclusively for their own use. So when someone tells you the West gives all this foreign aid to Africa, it might make sense to ask where that money actually came from. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think France is doing a good thing by providing Africa with a stable currency to do business in? Or is the wealth transfer that comes from seigneurage costing Africa more than the currency is worth? Let me know in those comments below. And as